1/6 video, Vestibular Paroxysmia, Introduction, History, and Epidemiology. Vestibular Physician.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling vestibular paroxysmia, which is a rare, frequently missed, but incredibly rewarding vertigo syndrome to master in the clinic. Listen, as vestibular physicians, neuro-otologists, and advanced practitioners, mastering this presentation isn't just optional. It's an absolute game changer for a very specific subset of your dizzy patients.
All right, here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit the clinical hook, define the entity, trace its history, look at the epidemiology, review the demographic profile, and finish up with key takeaways. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The clinical hook. Picture this classic presentation sitting right across from you in your clinic.
You've got a patient describing dozens of seconds-long spinning spells every single day, just back-to-back hits. But between these attacks, totally normal vestibular and auditory function. You know the type, they've tried repositioning maneuvers, nothing. Vestibular suppressants, absolutely useless. But then you give them a low dose of carbamazepine, and boom, a dramatic, almost miraculous response. I really want to hammer home these two pearls, the ultra-short, seconds-long duration, and that wild response to sodium channel blockers. That's vestibular paroxysmia in a nutshell.
All right, Section 2, Defining the Entity. Before we geek out on the data, let's get crystal clear on what we're actually dealing with here.
So what's the core issue?
Well, vestibular paroxysmia is fundamentally a neurovascular cross-compression syndrome. We're talking about recurrent, brief, incredibly stereotyped attacks of vertigo. And the whole shebang is driven by one thing: a pulsating vessel compressing the eighth cranial nerve. It really is that mechanical.
And this relies on a specific transitional zone vulnerability. The root entry zone of the eighth nerve, where we transition from central to peripheral myelin, is uniquely susceptible to focal demyelination from that pulsating vessel. You see, the cisternal segment of the vestibular nerve is pretty long, right? Like 14 to 19 millimeters. That gives a looping vessel plenty of real estate to make contact. This contact strips the myelin and creates an ephaptic short circuit. Literally electrical activity jumping between adjacent nerve fibers. Actually, a great way to think about this is the trigeminal neuralgia analogy. It's the ultimate cognitive anchor here. Exact same mechanism, exact same pharmacological response, just a different cranial nerve. If you understand trigeminal neuralgia, you already get vestibular paroxysmia.
Moving right along to Section 3, a history of discovery. Because this modern framework we use, it definitely didn't happen overnight.
Tracing this back, the whole vascular compression concept was actually established by Jannetta way back in 1975. He called it a hyperactive dysfunction of the eighth nerve. Then throughout the 80s, people were lumping these cases together under the label disabling positional vertigo. It wasn't until 1994 that Brandt and Dieterich hit the nail on the head and coined the exact term vestibular paroxysmia, really highlighting that carbamazepine response. For years, because the interictal signs are so subtle, these poor patients were just constantly mislabeled with atypical Meniere's or benign recurrent vertigo. Thankfully, in 2016, the Brandt Society stepped in with their consensus criteria and finally consolidated this into the framework we rely on today.
Which brings us to Section 4, Epidemiology and Prevalence. Let's see how those diagnostic criteria actually translate into the numbers we see today.
Now, look at the contrast between these numbers, because it tells a massive clinical story. In the general population, this condition is super rare. We're talking below 0.05%. But zoom into a specialized tertiary dizziness clinic, like the massive one in Germany that tracked 45,000 patients over 26 years, and suddenly that frequency jumps to roughly 3%. That is 1 in 30 referrals. It's a huge jump. To put that into perspective, it shows us just how often this diagnosis is completely missed in primary care. Catching this is an absolute game changer for a neuro-otology service.
Section 5, the demographic profile. Let's figure out who is most likely sitting in your waiting room with this.
Looking at the data, the mean onset is squarely in midlife, around 47 to 51 years old. It's about 55% female, so no major sex bias to write home about. You can see it in kids, but pediatric cases are super rare, though frankly probably underrecognized. But here's the real kicker: the offending anatomy. In about 75% of these cases, the culprit is the AICA, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. That's your usual suspect right there. Now, why that specific age range? Researchers have proposed this really elegant bimodal age structure. On one side, you have a small peak of young adults, and for them, it's usually developmental vessel anomalies. Think a congenital arterial fenestration. But then you have this much larger middle age group.
For them, it's just the natural wear and tear of aging. We're talking acquired arterial elongation and tortuosity that kicks in around the 4th to 6th decades. Over time, those aging vessels just elongate and loop right into that susceptible root entry zone. It's a purely mechanical progression.
Finally, Section 6, Summary and Next Steps. Let's tie this whole clinical picture back together.
All right, let's lock in those high-yield facts. Vestibular paroxysmia, brief, frequent, stereotyped vertigo caused by eighth nerve compression. The 2016 Barani criteria is your diagnostic gold standard. It makes up roughly 3% of tertiary dizziness referrals, typically hitting patients in their late 40s to early 50s. So here's a question for you to chew on. If you go look at your current patient load, how many folks currently sitting in your unexplained dizziness pile might actually have this incredibly treatable, mechanically driven condition? Worth a look, right?
Visit AustralianDizzinessClinics.com for the full literature review and clinical resources. In Video 2, we move to pathophysiology, neurovascular cross-compression at the root entry zone, and the aphaptic short-circuit mechanism.